Hi everyone, my name is Nitya Chanana and I am from CCAFS. And I, together with my colleague Stephanie Ma, will be presenting the Gender and Climate Resilient Agriculture, a scoping review. And we would be taking turns to present our study, and we will start with Stephanie. So over to you, Stephanie.
Thanks, Nitya. Talking about the background, climate resilient agriculture is aimed at building the resilience of agricultural systems to both long-term as well as short-term climate risks through adaptation and mitigation strategies. Now, these also include climate smart interventions or CSA. However, climate impacts are gendered, resulting in both a different scope and opportunity for adaptation and mitigation for men and women. Understanding the gendered aspects of climate resilient agriculture, therefore, is key to ensure gender equitable outcomes of interventions. While literature is steadily rising in this field, existing evidence is scattered, and there still remain certain gaps and challenges that require further efforts and attention. Research objectives. Keeping this in mind, we conducted the study with the aim to collate and synthesize available literature through a scoping review process to highlight key literature categories, present broad trends by categories based on predefined parameters, understand the key gaps, challenges, and opportunities that need to be addressed in future efforts in the field. Talking about the methods and the article selection, we began the process by collecting articles from both journal articles as well as grey literature using a keyword string of terms related to gender, climate change, and agriculture. We also used the words CSA and CRA in our search terms. The main source of journal articles was Web of Science database. For grey literature, we explored websites of organizations who are active in the field, with CG Space being the one with the most articles. Grey literature included reports, working papers, as well as briefs. At the screening stage, we removed duplicates and articles that were not in English. We further filtered the articles based on the eligibility criteria, which included, for instance, article not focused on gender dimensions of climate change in agriculture sector, and in the case of grey literature, articles related to disaster management and training material or a workshop report with no relevant material. Finally, 288 papers were selected for the review, with majority of them being journal articles. Now, talking about the methods, data collection, and analysis, CRA consists of short and long-term climate adaptation and mitigation strategies, which may or may not be CSA. At the same time, climate resilience is a fundamental concept of climate risk management and intervention are informed by the assessment of climate risk. We therefore combine the concept of climate risk, which is a function of vulnerability and impact, with resilient interventions, including CSA, to categorize the literature into three broad categories, namely CSA, other adaptation, and vulnerability/impact. Now, the CSA category included all articles related to gender and CSA technologies, practices, services, and other entry points, including climate finance, insurance, etc. Other adaptation included articles that are not focused on specific CSA interventions, but focus on the articles related to on-farm and off-farm adaptation interventions undertaken by farmers to deal with climate risk and related gender dimensions. Vulnerability/impact articles included those related to gendered vulnerability towards climate risk or gender differentiated impact of climate change in agriculture. After categorization, we collected two types of data. First, general characteristics of the articles, which included data publication, region, country, agriculture subsector, and research method. And the second consisted of qualitative information on pre-identified thematic areas, which included contextual factors of vulnerability, adaptive capacity, adoption parameters, and gender equality outcomes. These themes were identified based on basis these themes were identified based on a review of key synthesis articles in the area of gender, agriculture, and climate change. Talking about the results outline, Now we will now present the results, which are summarized as below. The general characteristics by literature category for all 288 articles, the publication type, temporal trend, geographical focus, sector and methodology, and the synthesis by thematic areas for CSA and other adaptation categories, where we had 158 articles, contextual factors, adoption parameters, gender equality outcomes.
Thanks, Stephanie. I will quickly now take you all through the key results of the review. First, quickly talking about the dominant category and the article type. Now, journal articles on CSA dominated the literature in the field. The next category with the most number of articles was vulnerability or impact-based category, followed by the other adaptation category. And while most of the gray literature articles belong to the CSA category, majority of the journal articles mostly looked at the vulnerability factors or the impact of climate change on gender relations. Looking at the trend of all the articles, we find that about 75% of the articles have been published since 2016. So the literature is fairly recent. And this increase since 2016 is primarily driven by the increase in publication of CSA related articles. And this could be possibly due to the fact that the CGIR had introduced a lot of CSA related projects. And this could also be one of the reasons why there was a sudden rise in CSA related publications, because about half of the publications published since 2015 have been by either CGIR affiliated authors or funded by CGIR. In terms of the geographical distribution, most of the research is concentrated in Africa, followed by Asia. And there's also a major chunk of the studies which are more global in nature. And this fairly kind of synthesizes with the climate change hotspots in terms of regions as well. But if we deep dive into the countries, we see that maximum of the studies have been conducted in India, followed by Uganda, Kenya, and Ghana. So even though regionally Africa has produced more articles, in terms of the country, India has been the one with maximum number of articles. And most articles in Asia have belonged to the vulnerability or the impact category as compared to other regions where CSA has been the dominant category. From a research methods perspective, qualitative research methods has been found to be the most commonly adopted method, followed by mixed methods across categories. And a few studies have also adopted a purely quantitative approach, and most of these have been journal articles. From an agricultural subsector perspective, within specific sectors, crop is the most common, followed by a focus on crop and livestock mixed sector. However, the overall majority, however, most of the articles have belonged to the other category, which primarily includes articles where either no specific sector is a focus area or it covers almost all the sectors. And this also comes from the gray literature articles, which are mostly general. And even in terms of journal articles, for instance, in the CSA category, there are a lot of articles related to policy or climate information services that are kind of applicable to almost all sectors. So this was an overview in terms of the key quantitative parameters that the review brings out. Now, if we get into specific research themes, apologies for so much text, but I'll just quickly summarize this. When we look at specific research themes, the first one is understanding the context-specific factors that define the differences, gender differences in vulnerabilities or in adaptive capacities of farmers. And we see that out of the total articles in which we did a full text review, which were 158 articles, 77% have included information on this particular theme of contextual factors. And most of them have highlighted that there are a lot of gender differences in terms of different kinds of resource access, with land being the most commonly cited resource. 63% of these have also highlighted certain individual factors or group-based socioeconomic factors, such as poverty or restrictive social and cultural norms, gender roles, household headship, even the perceived status of women farmers, as contributing to the difference in vulnerabilities and adaptive capacities of men and women farmers. Few articles have also pointed to unfavorable institutional factors, such as gender neutral government policies or gender neutral extension services, or limited participation in community based approaches. These factors lead to a low social capital for women, leading to a higher vulnerability to climate change as compared to men. Very few articles have also mentioned male out migration as a determining factor for vulnerability. While most articles talk about increased workloads as a result of male migration, some of them also mention the fact that despite increased involvement of women in farmers, increased workloads of women farmers, they still haven't had the concurrent improvements in agency or the decision-making part that should have come along with these responsibilities. And as a result, that is also a factor that contributes to their increased vulnerability. Second thematic area, which is about the parameters that define CSA adoption or adoption of any other adaptation intervention by men and women. Again, a good proportion of 70% of the articles talk about this theme, and half of them talk about the barriers for both men and women farmers, although majority of the literature is focused on the barriers that women face. These could be, again, in terms of the restrictive norms that prevent them from accessing different resources, or again, the very limited ownership of land and control, which would limit them or restrict them from implementing the interventions, the gender resource gap that exists, their limited decision-making capacity. From a men's perspective, articles have pointed out that weaker land rights of males in matrilineal societies, issues of finance and irrigation, water facilities, and also the cost of technology tends to be a barrier for them to adopt adaptation interventions or CSA in particular. And again, a similar proportion talks also about the different enabling mechanisms that have helped men and women farmers to adopt these technologies, which include a higher climate risk perception, a perceived usefulness of the technology, participation in women's groups, especially for women farmers, and CSA-related training and capacity building exercises, social networks. All these are enabling mechanisms that really help, especially women farmers, to be able to kind of overcome some of the barriers that they face and adopt technology. And the kind of interventions that these articles have spoken about majorly include interventions like climate policy, climate information services, conservation agriculture, and a lot of them talk about portfolios of interventions instead of a single intervention. And finally, coming to the gender equality outcomes. So we know what are the contextual factors and what is the adaptation arena looking like. But how does really adaptation help or not help in terms of achieving the gender equality outcomes? And this is the most under-researched theme. Only 41% of the articles are talking about this theme. And the most frequently covered outcomes include yield or income associated with CSA practices, improvements in decision-making or agency, changes in labor, or change in resource access, with yield or income being the most common of them. And improved decision-making and agency, so there is evidence on this through different practices such as conservation agriculture, climate information services, provision of capacity building, and participation in women's group. These have really helped women farmers in improving their decision-making capacity as well as agency, both at an individual as well as a group level. There is very limited focus on other gender equality outcomes such as health and nutrition, or a change in farming practices to adapt to climate change, or an overall empowerment perspective. So overall, to conclude, the key gaps that the scoping review highlights is in terms of, firstly, the few parameters that we mentioned: geography, focus, and methodology. Geographically, we see that there is limited research in Latin America and Southeast Asia. And while we do understand that majority of the research is focusing on Africa and Asia, the other regions are also dealing with uh, adverse impacts of climate risks. And there is a need to really focus on this region as well, move beyond the vulnerability category, look at different adaptations and their outcomes. Um, there also needs to be a more adaptation oriented focus in the livestock and fishery sector. There is very limited research in these two sectors, and most of it is centered around vulnerability aspects. So we need to move beyond that and increase our research in these areas as well. Also, from a methodology perspective, we really need to have a more robust evidence base, preferably using mixed methods. While most of our literature right now is qualitative, mixed methods is something that we would ideally want to focus on going forward. There is very limited research on value chains, mitigation related interventions in terms of scaling of adaptation interventions, and also very limited focus on water management related interventions. And these are some of the areas which also provide us an opportunity to now focus on. Just to kind of highlight what the literature points out as what seems to be working in this field, is that we see, as we mentioned before also, that we have seen an improvement in agency and decision making for women's group-based initiatives, and initiatives which help in reducing the knowledge gap, especially on climate information services or any kind of weather information, and also a lot of participatory approaches that involve different stakeholders, not just focusing on men and women as a whole, but also looking at the intersectional angles, looking at women from different age groups, from different social backgrounds, similarly with men. So all participatory approaches seem to be giving positive results. And from an overall point of view, most of the research right now is more of a diagnostic nature. And if we really need to push forward in this field, given the the nature of climate change being an urgent action point at the time, we really need to move from a diagnostics to a solution-oriented approach. And deriving from all the learnings that we have had from the scoping review, we can probably do it in the following few ways. We need to focus more on understanding what are the gender equality outcomes of CSA or CRA or adaptation interventions in general, including understanding the different synergies and trade-off between different outcomes. If we are achieving an increase in income, is it really having a different kind of effect on, say, workloads or on decision making? So what are the relationships of these outcomes as well in the short run and in the long run from a sustainability perspective? We also need to look deeper into the intersectional dimensions of climate resilient agriculture, especially in relation to understanding the role of men in helping women helping women to move forward together with them. Now, social norms have come across different areas as factors which have really limited the ability of women farmers to adopt these interventions or to deal with climate risks. And therefore, it's important that we look at gender transformative approaches to understand how do we really address these inherent gender norms. And that's a really important thing to do to build climate resilient food systems. And last but not the least, while there has been a lot of diagnostic research from a policy perspective, we really now have to focus on how do we move forward in making policy more gender responsive. So thank you.